Hi, welcome to Leadership Development Armory Lesson 3. Today we'll be hearing from Envoys Steve and Sharon Bussey about innovation within youth ministry. Please be mindful that because this was recorded on Zoom, the quality of the audio and video isn't great, but the quality of the content is exceptional. We hope that this lesson is of value to your ministry. Please enjoy.
So this week, we're really excited to hear from two guests today, and it is Envoys Stephen and Sharon Bussey. Envoys Steve and Sharon currently serve as territorial mission strategists for the Eastern Territory of the Salvation Army. The couple met in South Africa at age 14. After years of friendship and an eventual marriage, they moved to the United States in 1999, where they've served the Salvation Army in various ways, including as leadership specialists, co-directors of Railton School for Youth Worker Training, and founders of the first formal innovation department called Salvation Factory. Steve has studied theology, innovation, strategy, and business management, and Sharon has studied instructional design and project management, so they are both well equipped to lead the discussion on innovation with creativity and purpose. So thank you both for sharing with us today, and we are really excited. But first, can we just open up in prayer? And I asked if Envoy Sharon would do that. So thanks.
Sure, thanks for having us, guys. Let's have a word of prayer together. Father, we want to thank you for this time to learn and to grow. We thank you that you've given us minds to think and hearts to apply what you teach us. And so today, Lord, I just pray for wisdom as we learn together so that we'll not only gain new ideas and new concepts, but that we will be able to apply them effectively to your mission in the world. And so we thank you that we get to work together with you on what you are doing in our communities, in our appointments, in our responsibilities. And especially, Lord, today we just pray for your creativity to fill us and to renew us and to refresh us as we seek to be effective in ministry for you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Well, it's a privilege to be with all of you today, to spend a little bit of time just together talking about innovation, particularly in the field of youth ministry. It's a subject, both subjects, in the world of innovation, the world of children's and youth ministry, are areas of real passion for us. As Summer shared, we had been involved directly in youth ministry since we were 14. But along with that, ran Railton School for Youth Worker Training as well for 12 years. And so it's an issue which is very much on our hearts. We're involved in strategic mission out of the Chief's office right now, but to come back and to revisit this issue is something so near and dear to our hearts. As we talk about things today, just want to encourage you, like, this is really, we could talk about this for the next 3 months. We could talk for 3 hours straight and not take a breath, and that wouldn't be helpful to anyone. What we want to do is to really have a dialogue with you. And so our aim isn't to so much get through the material, because again, we can always revisit things, as much as it is just having conversation about what these mean to you, and to really sort of talk about how we can embed some of these principles into our ministry strategies. How we think about how we do things in the Salvation Army as well. Just to give you some background, we've entitled this Innovation, How to Make Creativity an Everyday Habit in Your Ministry. And just a couple of years ago, actually, we had the privilege of working with a company called Insight, and they put out this book called Eat, Sleep, Innovate. And the subtitle is How to Make Creativity an Everyday Habit inside your organization. And it was pretty cool to be able to talk with some of these people who are doing innovation across a breadth of pretty wild organizations. And we sort of stopped and paused and said, well, why is the Salvation Army in this conversation? But they were really interested in it. So we want to pull up our slides. And one of the things that was introduced was this idea that there are typical organizations that we go to when we think about innovation. If you think about a company like Pixar, that is filled with creativity. Scott Anthony, who wrote Eat, Sleep, Innovate, he used the acronym FANG. That whenever you read a book on innovation, you're either reading a book about Facebook or Apple or Netflix or Google, and when we talk about innovation in ministry, we might go to sort of typical locations. You know, and I mean, you could look at. I'm sure we could name, some sort of major mega churches and things like that we think of, and yet innovation often doesn't just take place in those one or two places. We believe that we're made in the image of God, and that we reflect His image, and the first way which God reveals Himself in all Scripture is that in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. And so this idea of creativity as being part of part of the essential nature of who God is, that being made in His image, each one of us are created with a level of creativity in which we participate with the divine creator in this partnership to really innovate in this world and to make it a better place. And so some of us might say, well, I'm creative, and others maybe not. I think that's a very narrow definition of creativity. I think there's a much broader one that when we are all really sort of seeing the restoration of the image of God within us, that creativity will come out. And so again, while we have these typical organizations that we think of, we want to sort of define innovation in a different way. Now, Scott Anthony, who wrote this book, Eat, Sleep, Innovate, he defines innovation as this. In an earlier book he wrote called The Little Black Book of Innovation, he defines innovation as doing something different that has impact. Now, I mean, just a very simple definition of doing something in a way that is different, that is going to have impact, is what one of the greatest scholars on innovation today would define as. When we talk about different, the question is, who are we aiming to innovate for? Are we just innovating for the sake of randomly innovating, or is it a missional focus that is driving our innovation, that there is a people who we're aiming to adapt what we're doing for the sake of? And then the question is when we innovate, what is the impact that it has? If we're just doing something and it doesn't make things better, it doesn't make our ministry more effective, and if there is no measurable result that can come from it, then it doesn't really fit the definition of what classically people would say innovation is. Now, in the Salvation Army, in our ministry, we very, very clearly have an aim. Each corps is appointed to a very unique community, in which the aim is to communicate the gospel to those particular individuals. And there should be outcomes which we are seeking to realize in our children's and youth ministry. And so if our aim is to have a measurable impact for a particular group of people, then asking ourselves, what is the most creative way to be able to accomplish this, to see the greatest scaled result? That's when we begin to see new space for new ideas, because we know what the intent is, who we're aiming for, etc. So we want to talk a little bit about that, and again differentiate this from normal organizations. Sharon, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the difference between FANG organizations and no debt organizations?
Well, yeah, and Scott Anthony would differentiate between those FANG, those kind of big companies that we look to, obviously, and he would say that the most interesting innovation takes place when we focus on what he calls no debts. And he defines that as a normal organization doing extraordinary things. That's where the Salvation Army kind of fits in. We're not necessarily known as these great innovators, and often, people think, oh, those are the people with the money and the people and the big ideas and all the time in the world to think up all these exciting new endeavors. But really, if we're thinking about that definition that Scott Anthony provided as innovation, having that impact, right, geared toward a specific group of people, having impact that is significant, then we qualify as this no debt normal organization doing extraordinary things. And that's why the Salvation Army is actually highlighted in that book that Steve showed earlier. But as we were talking to Scott Anthony and Natalie, the people who were writing the book, we said to them, often those FANGs, those kind of big name companies, they're almost in, if we transfer the analogy into the culinary world, which Steve and I are foodies, so this fits us. We would think about the Michelin star chefs, the people who are trained in cooking, They have spent years in, French schools, learning how to cook, memorizing recipes, and everybody applauds them for these incredible dishes that they produce, right? And so we said, that's one way to look at innovation. But really, in the Salvation Army, we're like the Italian grandmothers of innovation, right? We don't necessarily have all the expertise and training in top level innovation strategies, but we are meeting people at the point of need and coming up with new ideas to be able to effectively meet those needs with the resources limited, with the money, the people, the time that is very limited. We're coming up with new strategies and ways and using what is around us, just like an Italian grandmother would go foraging and use the recipes from her mother and her mother's mother, and make these beautiful dishes that really could stand up to that Michelin star chef. But it's done in a very different way. And so if we think about the Salvation Army in that way, it helps us to see that we actually are one of those no-debts, a normal organization that is doing extraordinary things. So in a lot of ways, in those kind of big name companies that are doing innovation in a very explicit way, they are talking about it. They're using a language that is connected to innovation. There's a very explicit sense of innovation. Conversely, in the Salvation Army, our innovation is a little bit more tacit. It's something that we just do naturally because we love people. We're responding to the need that we see in the moment. And I'm sure you've got examples in your head of where perhaps you even yourself have done this in the midst of the recent challenges of the COVID pandemic, things that you had to do differently, seeing the need and then responding in a different way to have a result, to have an impact on a particular group of people. And so you've probably got stories where you can see that kind of explicit innovation certainly is happening in top name companies, but in the Salvation Army, we're doing this innovation in tacit ways. So let's think about this a little bit differently. I want to introduce you to my great-great-great-grandmother, Ma Brophy. Now, I'm originally from South Africa, and in South Africa, there is a famous tart, kind of a pie called a milk tart. Summer makes them. So if you're nearby to Summer, you can have her make you one, right? But each family in South Africa has got their own milk tart recipe, right? And this is a recipe that gets passed down generation to generation, and each generation kind of protects that recipe, right? It's kind of a special recipe. So our recipe goes back to my great-great-grandmother, Ma Brophy. She was actually blinded in the Siege of Kimberley. And so this recipe that she created for milk tart, she would make without sight. So she would actually weigh the ingredients just using her hands. She knew what the weight was of the different pieces to put in the pie. And she would just do this tacitly. She then taught my grandmother, who was her granddaughter. And so she also learned how to weigh the ingredients just using her hands and being able to make these pies together. Well, when my mom married my dad, she had to learn the family recipe. And my mom was like, I'm not going to be able to figure this out with my hands. Sorry, that's my grandmother. And then my mother over here. So my mom said, I can't weigh these things out with my hands. I'm going to need to use some of these kitchen tools that I have. So whenever my grandmother would weigh it out with her hand, my mom would grab a measuring cup and say, okay, let's see, how much is this? Is this 1 cup? Is this 2 teaspoons? What is it? And so she really translated the recipe from something very tacit into something a little bit more explicit. And so she had these measurements down and she had them in her head. Now, I've got a terrible memory. So when it got passed on to me, I had to write it down on a recipe card, right? So pen and paper, took out the card, I wrote that recipe down. And then it got passed on. So it became more and more explicit. When I passed it on to Skylar and Summer, they're like, we're not going to be able to keep track of a recipe card. So I had to make a video for them so they could now track this recipe using a digital technology that they can access wherever they go. And so you can see this journey from taking knowledge that is tacitly known and turning it into something explicit, really helps us to be able to articulate our innovative strategy, or our strategy of innovation, how we're going to reach out to people to create that impact, as Scott Anthony said. How are we going to make that difference? Doing something different. Remember, that's the definition, that's going to have impact. So being able to articulate and share the same innovative language, the same language of innovation, is so critical, because it helps us to take that tacit knowledge and make it explicit, so that we can pass it on and we can connect the dots from one generation to another.
So what Sharon said about like passing something on from one generation to the next is also true when it comes to scaling something, not just across time, but across space. And so if we want to do something different that's going to have impact, I might have one really good idea, and at my core, I'm implementing it. But being part of the Salvation Army means that we're connected to this network of people with a shared aim. And so the question is, how do we take something that's a great experiment, a great recipe, if you're using Sharon's term, and find a way to be able to scale it so that it has significant impact in many different locations. This is something that was our specialty, and if you go back in our history, you see this in terms of the history of children's and youth ministry as well, that out of this empathy and need comes some incredible scaled impact. So if we go back in the history of the Salvation Army, we know that in 1865, Catherine and William Booth, after leaving the Methodist New Connection, came to East London and founded people who they said, this is where we want to have impact. In 1865, in Victorian London, they said that at nighttime, on the roofs of East London, there were literally thousands of children which would fall asleep at night. They said as well that Lord Shaftesbury, one of the famous Victorian reformers, was brought to East London at night, and he offered to give a loaf of bread to any child who would come and meet him. And he was standing close to the roofs, and it was really dark at night, and he thought maybe there was one or two children. And they said that basically the roofs came alive as like thousands of children started coming down, and he began to realize that East London was filled with children. Similarly, again, when William and Catherine Booth landed in East London, they recognized that if they were going to go into the highways and the hedges of East London and compel people to come to faith in Christ in that community, that part of the major ministry of the East London Revival Society that became the East London Christian Mission was to minister to children. So as early as 1866, we see evidence in history of children's and youth ministry work taking place. Now, again, like our ministry to those who were women and men who were struggling with alcohol or addiction, stuff like this, the ministry with children started very tacitly, trying to figure out what do we do with these. In fact, early on, there was a guy named James Rapson who headed up children's and youth ministry, and he was trying all sorts of things, opening up ragged schools and others, just trying to see what it can be done that would have significant impact. Well, that continued on, and they say that that by 1877 they had children's missions, they had ragged schools, they had Sunday schools, and all sorts of different innovative programmatic strategies to reach out to children. But by 1877, what they were realizing is that Sunday schools, where kids were literally being taught how to read, it was a literacy program during that day where children would be they would be introduced to the Bible, and they would learn how to read English by reading the Bible. And it came to a point where William Booth began to realize that children were reading the Bible and were thinking that they'd experienced Christianity, but in fact that they weren't actually getting saved. And so what happened is the scheme of Sunday schools, William Booth said that if we are giving people a version of the gospel, which they think they've experienced Christianity, but it's not leading to true transformation, he said we're actually inoculating this generation from the possibility of experiencing true impact, true spiritual impact. So he actually Catherine and William Booth banned Sunday schools in 1877. A fun fact, we said, we're not going to do that type of ministry with kids. And he said, there's got to be another way. So from 1877, for the next 3 years, there was this exploration of what is it that we could do to be able to reach out to this younger generation of thousands of kids. And as this Christian mission expanded beyond East London to other parts of the United Kingdom, this continued to be this mandate of how are we going to reach the children. It was something that William Booth would weep about at nighttime as well, that we must find a way to reach the kids. Well, in 1880 in Blyth, England, there was an officer named Captain John Roberts. He'd been mentored under George Scott Railton. And in Blyth, England, he was holding these meetings where there were, again, massive amounts of adults who were coming to hear the gospel. And there were some kids who came to him and said, please, can I come into the meetings? And he literally had no space for the children. So he said, he actually put up a sign saying, no children are allowed in these meetings. And this child came on in one evening and said, please, sir, can I somehow get into this meeting? And he sent her away. And at that point, the Holy Spirit convicted him and said, the words of Jesus saying, suffer the little children who come to me and forbid them not, for the kingdom of God belongs to such of these. That came into his mind, and he said, we need to have a ministry, an event that was just for kids. And so he ran after them. He said, come back tomorrow night, and we're going to have a program in which no adult will be allowed, but you need to bring your friends. And they ended up bringing dozens and dozens of kids, and those kids got saved. And then he had to begin to disciple them, because as a salvationist, he was taught that you don't just get people saved, but you need to keep them saved, and then you need to train them to get other people saved. And so he began to say that while this terminology of soldiery had been introduced for adults, he said, we're going to call you guys little soldiers. And that was the beginning of a new innovation in the Salvation Army, where children were perceived of as saints that would become soldiers as well. Well, William Booth caught hold of this, and he said, we need to scale this. We need to send this through all the United Kingdom. That's the solution that we're looking for. And they began to scale this, that it could have impact. They actually said that we became so radical that people in secular newspapers were writing about this, that the Salvation Army crossed the line, because now they were mobilizing children in mission. They had created a magazine that was one of the, I think the earliest magazines published for children in the United Kingdom was called the Little Soldier magazine. And children were selling this. And people were just like, this was one of the greatest scandals in church history, that children had a significant role. They weren't just street urchins, but they had a role, they had a responsibility. By 1885, Adjutant Stanley Ewens had been made the first divisional youth secretary. And the aim was to build an infrastructure that would support the scaling of this ministry to children and youth. And by 1888, William Booth officially launches, and the name shifts from the little soldier to the junior soldier, and he launches this Junior Soldiers War. And this is what William Booth says in this presentation. He says, I want you to engage in a threefold task. Maybe we can look at this and we'll go back to the other one in a second, Sharon. He says, now you have a threefold work before you. You want to get the children, you want to save them, the children. You want to keep them saved, and then you want to train them so that they shall grow up, not only consecrated to the work of saving others, but also skillful in the war. And this is how, really children's and youth ministry becomes a dominant part of who we are. Now, I want us to go back to that previous slide, which Sharon just put up. And what we see is that there's always a past. There's always a form that our ministry has taken. And within that form, there are some things of value. That's where we really have the vision of what this can be. And in many ways, who we are and why we do what we do, the intent of it is there. And there are parts of that which are rooted in the past that we need to make sure that we are aligned to. But we also have to disrupt ourselves. While we have to remain aligned to the intent of an innovation, of why something exists. Innovation is about asking the question, what do we need to adapt so that we can do, so that the people that we're aiming for, that we can have impact, as we say, what innovation is. So there has to be this tension between the past and the future in our innovation, between alignment and adaptation. Now, those who align and ignore adaptation can have a static form right? And those who adapt but forget about the alignment can sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. What we need to do is to hold those two in tension if we're going to have a disciplined process of innovation. Secondly, as well, that there are periods where disruption, what Catherine and William Booth did when they stopped Sunday school, is they created chaos. They said, we have this people we need to reach. We need to begin to have a culture of exploration where we begin to search out and to see, is there a better way to do things? What John Roberts eventually found, again, while they tested and had these small experiments and things, they weren't going to scale anything until they found something that could validate that something different would have impact. And then once they did, that's when they began to exploit that innovation. Exploit, sounds like a negative word, but it's taking that and scaling that so that it can have significant impact. Yes, Harriet, as well. We're not doing the saving. It's God who's doing the saving, but he calls us to participate with him in this mission, for sure. Absolutely. So, again, this is the process of taking something that once it's tested, the scaling is about finding a way to take that idea which one person had and to be able to allow other people to benefit from the creativity of an individual so that collectively we can realize a greater impact. So Sir Ken Robinson says this. He says the role of a creative leader is not to have all the ideas. William Booth wasn't sort of sitting there and saying, well, here's what we're going to do, and you're going to do it exactly this way. Rather, what they did is he recognized, Catherine and William recognized that everyone has ideas, right? So the role of a creative leader is not to have all the ideas, it's to create a culture where everyone can have ideas and feel that they are valued, and a mechanism by which we can capture those ideas so that the best ideas can be scaled to be able to have collective impact.
So often when it comes to innovation, Stephen, I find that there's a lot of myths surrounding it.
Sorry, Sharon, let's just pause before we get to the next section, because we've sort of downloaded a lot on you guys. Any comments or anything like that before we press on?
Or questions?
All right. Let me just say this as well, that what we end up seeing is that baton then is passed from generation to generation to generation, like Sharon said in terms of the recipe card. And like today, we still are inheriting those early innovations. But I think along the way, what we have to ask ourselves is, again, the form might have to change. The essence of the idea needs to remain the same. But the question is, maybe are there some things that are barnacles that are a form that no longer is producing the impact? And how do we find a way to edit the form while staying true to the intent? I think that's part of what our goal is in this conversation. So that leads us now to this exploration of what are some of the myths that we have in regards to innovation.
Yeah, like I was saying, Stephen, I find that often in terms of innovation, there's a lot of myths that almost need to be busted, right? There's a kind of a way of thinking when we think about innovation, like we mentioned earlier, the FANGs, often our mind goes to that. Big budgets, big ideas, and so often it's innovation can happen in a lot of different ways. It's a very disciplined process. It's not a free-for-all, and there are certain parameters and guardrails that have to be set in order for innovation to be effective. And they're actually principles that even those FANG organizations apply. And so it's something that we can learn from. So usually we focus on 10 innovation myths. We're just going to cover the first 5 so that we can have opportunity for discussion as well. And if there's interest, we can come back and do the other 5. The first 5 are focusing on general innovation myths, and the last 5 focuses on a specific process of innovation, on how you can actually take principles and apply them to everyday ministry. So let us know, someone will let us know if there's any interest to take you guys through the final 5, but we're happy to do that. But first of all, let's just take a look at myth number 1. And perhaps you can raise your hand in the chat. I think there's a little icon that you can use to do that. If this is a myth that you have perhaps thought about, we won't say bought into, but thought about. So often this is the myth. Innovation is about what's new and cool, right? Any hands? I'll give you a chance to respond. So often we find with innovation, we can be focused on the new and cool. And so focused on making sure that we are kind of being the trendy people, right? Setting the trend, being kind of ahead, one step ahead, different to everybody else, that we can sacrifice functionality and purpose for the sake of coolness, right? And like this illustration in the video, we have to, in the keynote, we have to ask, have these people missed the boat, right? A church out on the water with no way to get to it it might be a great, cool idea, but is it really innovative? Because can it really have impact, right? And so that's the big question that we have to always ask ourselves, because innovation is not always about just the new and cool. But let's take a look at this example of a guy who thought that innovation had to focus just on new and cool, and he met with some interesting results. So watch this video. Hopefully the audio works great for you, and you can chat about it with us afterwards. Listen to this.
I'm always looking for the path of least resistance, which is why I moved my entire office into a pool. I'm Rich Lewis, and I run the world's only fully ergonomic aquatic office. I had watched my team try everything to make their life at work more comfortable: standing desks, exercise balls, walking desks. They've even got a freelancer who started working remote in an elaborate bed desk system. But everything changed once we got in the water. Now that gravity isn't holding the team down, profits and morale are going up. Even our remote workers want to come to the office these days. People assume it's expensive, but we had some extra budget at the end of the fiscal year, and you know what they say, if you don't use it, you lose it. Obviously, there were a number of logistical questions, the biggest one being, how do we get the electronics in the water? Isn't it dangerous? It was actually pretty easy. We used commercial-grade plastic wrap, and just like that, we were in business in the water. And for paper, a quick trip to the laminator does the job. It's honestly not all that different from a normal office. Our casual Friday is admittedly a bit more casual. Some people worry about their staff getting too comfortable and them getting complacent. I just don't think that's going to be an issue here. The ups and downs of office politics haven't disappeared, but the issues are different. And the facility staff have been very understanding about the changes. I've always been inspired by Bruce Lee, who said, be like water. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water in a bottle, it becomes the bottle. And when you put your staff in water, you got to hire a lifeguard. That's not good.
So I guess that's a big question for us. When we're talking about innovation, are we sacrificing functionality, purpose, intentionality for just doing something that's cool? So back to Scott Anthony's definition, to remember what innovation really is. It's doing something different. It might not necessarily be new and cool, but it is different to what we are usually doing. But its success is measured by its impact. Is it actually producing an outcome that we can measure, a result that we can validate? Otherwise, all we're doing is something different for ourselves, right? And it's not actually accomplishing anything of purpose or meaning. And so particularly in ministry, right, with limited resources, with limited time, we want to make sure that what we are innovating in is actually having the result, the intended result. And that result was defined earlier by that William Booth quote, reminding us what our job is in terms of children, right? To lead them to the Lord, to disciple them, and then to teach them how to witness for Christ and to lead others to him. So that's myth number one. Innovation is about what's new and cool. We're going to look quickly at myth number two, and then maybe we can stop for questions.
Yeah, sure. So myth number two is again to the other extreme, where some people think it's all just about the cool thing. There are others who are very comfortable with the way which things are, with status quo, that sort of say innovation is not necessary. There was a quote that was done in 1998 or something like that by Peter Drucker, and it goes like this. He says, the Salvation Army is by far the most effective organization in the U.S. Have you guys heard this quote before? That no one can ever come close to it in respect to clarity of mission, the ability to innovate, measurable results, dedication, and putting money to maximum use. Great quote. We used to use this all the time, a few years back. But Peter Drucker, the same guy who said this, he also said the following. He said, the only thing that we know about the future is that it will be different. And again, while we have an incredible legacy of innovation, having a legacy of innovation does not mean that you are going to innovate today. In fact, there's what's called the innovator's dilemma, that when we have success, we can become so defined by a success that our identity is wrapped in a form to the point where we won't be willing to let it go. So let me throw it a sacred cow. Imagine, okay, when you say youth ministry in the Salvation Army and I say the word camping, do those two things go together? Absolutely. All throughout the United States, we see incredible camping ministry, right, take place. What if camping was no longer producing the impact that we have had in the past? Would that be something that we would say we are not defined by just doing camping in children's and youth ministry, that we could walk away from camping and find a new way to have scaled impact with kids during a summertime? Is that possible? Think about our music programs. If that wasn't having impact, could we disrupt that? Or are we so defined by that we couldn't find another way to do that? See, sometimes our identity becomes so bound to a form that we're not willing to think beyond that very tight definition. And we all have somebody who we sort of see as being stuck in status quo. But we always see ourselves as the person who's avant-garde, the person who's constantly innovating and stuff like this. But what happens is somewhere along the way, we go from being the new guard to being the old guard. And we begin to defend things unless we begin to recognize that forms have a life cycle. There's a time where a form of ministry might not be producing the impact that it once had. And it requires us either stepping back and saying, do we need to re-engineer this and to keep it, but to really sort of maybe tune it up so that it is having that impact? Or does it come to a point where we say, this great form of ministry is no longer working, therefore we need to find a new way? I'll give you one great example. In the Salvation Army, in up to the 1960s, 1970s, even early 1980s, the Salvation Army was at the forefront of running massive hospitals. But it was no longer, having an impact at state governments. There was all sorts of complexity taking place. And as a result of that, we had to walk away from that form to find a new way because that form of ministry had been disrupted. This we have to think about in children's and youth ministry. We have to innovate or we die. And so when you think about innovation, there are some companies which we think about, but look at these for-profit organizations. Has anyone been to a Toys R Us recently? Well, maybe they pop up at Christmas time, Or when last were you at a Blockbuster Video, right? These were things that we saw as staple organizations, but some of them became so committed to doing things the way which they'd done that they didn't realize they were being disrupted, and as a result of that, they're no longer with us. Scott Anthony says this: in today's world, innovation is not a choice. If you do not innovate, you are sowing the seeds of your own destruction. Now, this is true not just for outside businesses. This isn't just true for nonprofit corporations. This is true for us as the church. Right now, statistics came out last year that said they're predicting that 70% of those who call themselves Christians within the church today are technically not saved by a classic definition of what we say salvation is in terms of justification by grace through faith in Christ Jesus, right? They're predicting that potentially 70% of people who come to church are not actually experiencing that. That's not just true of adults. That's also even more so true of kids. Take a look at Kendra Creasy Dean's book, Almost Christian on Youth Ministry. It was published about 10, 15 years ago. And even that long ago, she was recognizing a dramatic change in our culture. And it requires that we understand our intent, but along with that, begin to find new ways to be able to reach out to individuals as well. Let me pause for a second here. Harriet's saying this: I definitely agree that the summer camp needs to be revamped and looked at for sure. However, each week during the Come to Jesus Chapel at camp, more kids come to meet Jesus in a week and the most corps produce in a year. The secret number for summer camp is beyond anything I've seen in any corps. I agree. By the way, I'm not saying that camps aren't working. I'm saying if they were to cease working, would we be willing to disrupt and reinvent? I think that there's some amazing things that we can learn from summer camps to bring into our corps even as well. Ernie also says, I truly believe that we have to be working hard to keep camp relevant. As the world changes so rapidly, we need to make sure we are giving those who may never have it an opportunity to grow and see nature, mountains, trees, lakes, having grown up in the mountains. Okay. So he says more. You can read that stuff in the chat. Thank you, Ernie, for those great comments.
Yeah,
here's the thing.
Yes, Steve, is that there's a difference. There's a little bit of a difference between incremental innovations and disruptive innovation, right? Those are two different things. So in some cases like camp, if we continue with incremental innovation, we can keep it very relevant, and it might continue to be a very effective ministry for who knows how long. The goal is that we've got to keep alert to those changes and keep checking in on those forms, keep assessing our results and making sure that our impact is matching up with matching the input that we are putting into it and the impact that we're seeking to achieve. And then you've got the disruptive innovation, which is, you know what, hospitals just aren't working anymore. This is a place we've got to pull out of. So we've got to be able to know the difference between those things and keep assessing. And I think the goal with innovation is never to get stuck, never to become complacent in a form. We always want to hold to the strategic intent. That's not something we want to change. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of myths coming up. But we want to make sure that we are constantly evaluating that impact so that we are making sure that the forms are achieving that result. And if not, we can apply incremental innovation or disruptive, depending on what's best suited.
And so again, yeah. And so when it comes to this awareness of when's the right time to when to engage in incremental innovation, when does it require disruption? It requires that we really understand the intent behind what we're doing. There was this meme that came up. By the way, William Booth used this term, this question of, are we asleep at our post? And he's talking about, have we been lulled into this state where we're no longer thinking with great strategic intentionality about why we're doing what we're doing? And there was this meme that just came out, I think it was like a week or two ago, using a Lord of the Rings clip, and said 15,000 hours of ungodly secular thought, and then on to university. And they said, in children's ministry, what's our strategy for them? Here we go. Next slide. Not to worry. We'll have them color a picture of Noah's Ark on Sunday, And so when you think about what is our objective when it comes to children's and youth ministry, again, William Booth said our goal is to save children, again, recognizing that's a work of God that we're participating in, but then to disciple them, to raise them up, so that their head, their hand, their heart is aligned to God's will and way, again, adapted to their generation, but that's being done and that they're being mobilized. What happens in our times which we have an opportunity to engage our kids? Are we simply entertaining our kids, amusing them? Are we just offering sort of free babysitting with some sort of side entertainment? Or is there a strategic intent that we need to innovate, that we still need to accomplish in our children's and youth ministry? That's a deeper conversation, which we'll probably maybe just be able to touch on for today. Okay. So again, when we look at this, we have to recognize we have to be disruptive. Catherine Booth says there's no improving the future without disturbing the present. And the difficulty is to get people to be willing to be disturbed. Now, again, we always see, yes, that's true of other people. That's what I've been saying for years. We need to disrupt other people, right? But here's the thing: it's a mirror reflection. Again, I see as well the conversation with, yes, we need to have this with senior leaders and stuff like this. But here's the question: in what ways does this hubris creep into me, Steve Bussey, myself? Are there ways in which I need to be disrupted from my own status quo? Because I think that sometimes slips in. Yeah.
I would say,
Laura says, I think sometimes we stretch ourselves so thin we end up handing out the coloring sheets. That's true. And that requires, again, a look at our portfolio of programs and asking ourselves, is doing a lot that doesn't have impact, is that the most effective strategy, or do we find a way to choose a few critical strategies and to have impact. Now, I know that there are bigger discussions about what is being required of us. It's something that we're having within our own territory as well, in terms of what is a standard strategy, where do we aim at, and what do we do well. I think if we make that definition of doing something different that has an impact, for the gospel, for the kingdom of God being reflected on earth as in heaven, I think our priorities will become very clear. So myth number 2, some people say innovation is not necessary. It absolutely is.
Right. And I think this quote that Catherine Booth mentions is really, if you go and you read the full article, and we can even send that on to Summit to distribute if any of you are interested, there's a link for it. But she's really speaking about differentiating between the form and the strategic intent, the gospel, right? We don't change the gospel, but we've got to be disrupted in how we are communicating the gospel. So we're going to go into that a little bit more in a minute. So you've focused on myth 1 and 2, and we've had some good conversation. Are there any questions before we go any further, or any other thoughts or comments? There's been great comments in the chat that I've been reading, so thank you for all of that. It is challenging, isn't it, Grant? Like being able to really challenge our own sense of stuckness, right? We feel comfort in the things that we know and that we're familiar with and we're used to. It's hard even to challenge ourselves. So anybody else? Ernie's feeling attacked by coloring in sheets.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I just wanted to say that comment about handing coloring in sheets about Noah's Ark, that really struck me. I mean, that's what we fall back to, right? Because that's easy.
Yeah.
But we could do so much more. That's left me. It's left a big mark on me. Just that single thought.
Yeah.
Wow. That's great. It hit me too, Grant, because we've been guilty of that too, right? You get busy and you are stretched too thin, and you do what you think is the best in the moment, right? But I think what Steve's pointed to is that portfolio, right? Being able to step back. And what we're discovering in our new role is how closely innovation and strategy are connected, right? And so if we're going to allow, you almost have to budget time to be able to think about innovation, of how to really take this particular form and innovate it so that it's achieving the impact that's needed. So that requires strategic thinking, because we're all busy and we've got limited time, money, resources, people, and we've got to sit back and say, what can we realistically do? And as Steve said, what can we realistically do well? So we have to differentiate, is our core, or the ministry that we're involved in, is that more like a food truck, or is it more like a mom and pop restaurant, or is it more like a 5-star restaurant, right? That has all the leadership, all the money, all the resources, right? And based on that maturity level, we can then begin to determine how many types of ministries we can realistically manage while doing them all well. So if a food truck takes on the menu of a 5-star Michelin restaurant, they're not going to succeed. But if they say, I'm going to make 5 different types of hot dogs and I'm going to make them the very best that I can, they're going to be the best hot dogs in all of New York, right? Or all of California, right? That's the difference. So you focus on what we can do, and that's a strategic conversation. So what are the key things that we need to focus on? What do we need to scale back from so we can actually do these things well? So we're not handing out coloring in sheets to children and sending them to hell, right? Because ultimately that's what we're doing. If we believe in heaven and hell, that's what we're doing. We're inoculating kids, as Steve said, to the gospel. We're giving them a false gospel and making them believe they're saved. And when the gospel can't actually help them in real life, it doesn't have real impact in their lives, they think that they've had the real thing. And so they give it all up. When they go to college, they're like, forget about it. It didn't work when I was a kid. It's not going to work now. Right? So in a sense, we're inoculating kids, which is why William Booth banned those Sunday schools in the first place, right? Yeah. So it's focusing on what we can actually do and what we can do well.
I'm wondering whether that's worth pausing just on those two. I mean, again, we could go in more, but maybe it's worth us staying on this as well and sort of saying this, that radical prioritization in youth ministry and children's ministry is critical. Again, we might have a core where, there's only a handful of individuals. And if that handful of people is senior citizens, maybe the best strategy for children's and youth ministry is to not start children's and youth ministry at this point, but to work with those senior citizens to a point where they are saved, they are being discipled, and they're being equipped to the point where maybe they're willing to become leaders. And then at that point, some of their grandkids, then become a vehicle through which now you have a team of people to begin to expand into children's and youth work. Similarly, if you just have kids in your core and you have no adults and things like that, maybe you need to start there. But the question is, what are you going to start with? Are you going to stretch yourself and do 5 or 6 different programs when you have limited resources? You might be the only leader there. Or do you find a way to focus on what's going to really matter, right? Not just in terms of let me just do a lot of things and I'm going to run things and it's all going to be built around me as a, say, core officer. I get appointed somewhere else. And then because I'm no longer there, everything falls apart. Maybe part of the strategy is saying, what can I do to allocate only this amount of time to do this type of initiative, kids, but then along with that, to raise up people who will be able to be local leaders who can actually sustain that, so that when I leave, that it doesn't implode. Part of this is thinking strategically about how we take that limited time, that limited space, the limited bandwidth which we have, and invest it as good stewards so that we can actually have something that's a sustainable, scaled impact within that local community. What do you guys think?
I was just going to say that in the education world, they talk a lot about differentiation and adjusting based on the needs of the kids that are there, right? So you have to be able to know who your audience is. You have to be able to know your kids, to have those relationships, to then be able to say, oh, Tommy over here, he doesn't like coloring. So maybe a coloring sheet is going to be good for him. But maybe this kid, they really need a snack whenever they do things. So just being able to know what the needs are of the audience so that you're able to adjust in that way. And I think that innovation is very similar in the fact that you have to be able to do research to be able to be aware of who are the people that you're innovating for. What are the needs that are needing to be met, and how can you adjust in that way? And it feels like this very complex thing of how am I going to do all this stuff? And I think that that's because we've put in our minds that when we make an adjustment, when we plan something, it has to fit everybody. And the truth of the matter is that it will never fit everybody. Everybody has different needs, different perspectives. So if we, instead of trying to make this whole umbrella that's going to fit every single person in it, if we instead give tiny umbrellas to fit each of the different things, it feels like a lot, but the effort that you're putting into making this big umbrella, I feel like it's going to be a lot more than it's probably going to be about similar because you're covering the same bandwidth, right? So it just, sometimes it can feel like this really overwhelming idea of how am I supposed to adjust for all those different people? But if you're able to condense it down to a simpler form and then say, okay, how can I make it malleable, make it adjustable? That ultimately is going to be able to adjust and provide for those needs in that way.
Yeah.
So some of that's great comments. The last 5 myths that we focus on actually unpack design thinking, which is a process of innovation. And one of the first step in that is actually empathizing, being able to understand what the needs are, right? And then beginning to formulate ideas around those needs. So anyway, that's a whole nother conversation, right?
Can I add something as well to that when we talk about needs, again, a child made in the image of God has both temporal needs and eternal needs. And again, we've always had a two sort of a pincer strategy, a dual approach where our aim is to find a way to meet the temporal needs and to meet the eternal needs. The word temporal in Latin, it is actually the word secular. Right? There are secular needs, things like I'm hungry, I need food, or I need to learn how to read, or I need to socialize. These are things that can reflect God's image, right? But if we just do, and then there are eternal needs as well that we want to ensure that people are saved. We don't, as Sharon said, we don't want to hug kids and tell them what we love them, but then leave them in a state of eternal crisis. And so the idea is that we have to have a what we call salvation for both worlds strategy, that we're attacking on both ends in whatever youth ministry we have, so that we are meeting their needs in Jesus' name, and making sure that they are saved, which is the mission, and that then when we're able to grow them up as child saints as well. So that idea of saving their soul, growing saints, serving suffering humanity is reflected even in our children's and youth ministry. And that's what we do.
Okay. Well, I think we've got 5 minutes left. Maybe we go on to the next myth, and if there's, we can leave a little bit of space for questions and conversation. So let's take a look at the third myth. The third myth is innovation is not permitted. And sometimes we do encounter this. And sometimes we're the ones who are not permitting innovation because we're afraid of change, because we like the way things were and we feel comfortable. But sometimes we're facing that challenge from folks in our core, or perhaps our core office, or perhaps the young people themselves, or perhaps the parents that are struggling with change. And so we can begin to come up against a little bit of a wall there. You can take a look at that little cartoon on the screen. I'll read it for you in case you can't see. It says, your proposal is innovative. Unfortunately, we won't be able to use it because we've never tried something like this before. Right? And so we encounter these innovation antibodies, they're called, that really attack any kind of new idea. So here's the workaround that we have discovered for ourselves, is that often people resist change because they feel like you are changing something that their identity and purpose is wrapped up in. They're worried that something's going to be lost in the change, that strategic intent piece is going to be missed, and that we are just about the new and the cool and the exciting, and that we're going to toss the baby out with the bathwater. And so we have to be really careful in being able to articulate that what we're seeking to change is not the essence, but the expression. So take a look at these 3 images on the screen. We've got an ice cream, a cupcake, and some cookies. And what is the common denominator across all of these? I'll tell you, it's vanilla, right? It's the essence of vanilla that's contained in the vanilla ice cream, the vanilla cupcake, and the vanilla cookie, right? And so when we're thinking about essence, it is the defining factor. It's the strategic intent, the original purpose of a particular form, a particular program, a particular activity, a particular idea. And so we can actually change the external, the expression of that particular form, while making sure that we don't lose the essence. Now, Catherine and William warn, and they say you can hold on to the form, the external, and have completely lost the essence. And we've got to be careful with that. And that can sometimes happen. And so that's when we've got to keep evaluating that impact. Is what we're doing still having the impact that we intend? And so we've got to make sure that we are assessing that, and that we are holding on to the essence, because that's the part that we don't want to change. So the essence is the definitive value that forms the substance of the expression. That's vanilla, right? And then the expression is a localized, temporary style that communicates that particular value. So that's the part that we want to be able to change. We can change the expression. We don't want to change the essence. This is where we get the stability versus agility. And Steve's going to talk to us a little bit about the who and why and the how and what of our organization.
Yeah, so, and maybe we'll finish with this because we realize we've only got like a minute left here. But when it came to the Salvation Army, Catherine William Booth designed the Salvation Army to be what we would call an ambidextrous organization. They realized that if they were going to accomplish their vision, which is to live for the glory of God and the salvation of the world, there was elements that needed stability in our governance. When we talk about an autocratic structure, the autocratic structure was there to bring stability to the who we are, our identity, and the why we exist, our purpose. in terms of identity and purpose, what they said is that regardless of where we are in the world, regardless of what generation we are in across time and space, there has to be something that knits us together that says this is who we are as a people, and this is why we exist as a denomination, as an organization. And so the idea is that this essential identity and purpose is what makes us a people called the Salvation Army. But when it comes to how we do that, which is our strategy, and what that looks like, which is our structure, that we're permitted to have agility, that we need to have speed to be able to adapt our measures to the times and circumstances in which we live. And so William Booth said this. He said that while we do not require any new revelation about salvation, he says, here's the thing, and when it comes to Salvation Army, we're not about innovating our doctrines, right? He says, while we do not require any new revelation about salvation or its author or character, there is room, nay, an absolute necessity for definite improvement in the methods employed for its promulgation. And they said there will not only be liberty, but the necessity to adapt its methods so far as it is consistent with truth and righteousness to the character and habits of the people, the salvation of whom it is there to bring about. So as we come to the end of this one, maybe this is just what we can finish with, is that idea of how do we stay true, right, to our identity, our purpose, our doctrine, our discipline, while still giving permission to ourselves to continue to disrupt, to ask ourselves, how might we do this better? I think that has been the sweet spot. And sometimes we hold back and we refuse to innovate. And sometimes we say, let's innovate things that we shouldn't be innovating. And the thing is that we sometimes have stability in terms of our expression. And we say agility when it comes to our identity, our purpose, our doctrine, it's like a theological choose your own adventure over here, but we're not changing this, And the question is, how do we get those two, back in the order which was designed to be and where we saw the most scaled results? I think when we do that, we're going to see exceptional innovation truly beginning to take place, and not just innovation that looks cool, but doing something different that will have impact in the world. So we'll pause there. I mean, guys, there's so much more that we could talk about this. And again, our aim was just to sort of begin to introduce these ideas to you. Again, there's far more which we could do. Just to let you guys know as well that we have a group that meets called Sword and Shield. We're actually sort of going through a deep exploration of that identity and purpose in the Salvation Army. If you're interested, just connect with us on Facebook, and we'd be happy to invite you to the group. We're working through sort of a Wesleyan and a Salvationist theological identity, if you guys are interested in that. Along with that, when it comes to innovation, happy to chat to anyone as well if you want to reach out to us, and happy to set up a Teams call or a Zoom chat and stuff like that. Any other last questions or comments before we finish?
Okay, well, thank you both so much for your time. And we can kind of, if we'll end the meeting officially now, but if anybody wants to stay on and ask something of Envoy Stephen, Sharon, feel free to just stay on for just a couple minutes. But yes, thank you both for your time and your willingness to share with us. And it's so important to realize the need for innovation, not just that it's cool or fun to do, but that it's actually necessary for us to stay just in with, and youth, especially youth culture is constantly changing. Like the perspectives and the different things we need to be willing to adapt and willing to adjust. And that means not getting rid of like our doctrine, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, but to be able to adapt the way that we work with kids and the way that we talk to them and just those kinds of things. So thank you both so much. Thank you everybody for staying on, even though it's a little bit past the time. Feel free to stay on if you would like to chat anymore with Envoy Stephen, Sharon. Have a great one.